Recording in progress. Welcome back. So in the first part, we talked about the basic maps. We've got a diffuse base color map. We've got a spec map, gets plugged into the specular weight, controls the level or amount of reflectivity. Roughness maps get plugged into specular roughness. They control more than one level of roughness on a surface. We also talked about bump map. Simple bump map uses black and white information. White looks like the surface has a bump on it or it's raised off of the surface. Black looks like it's indented, meaning it looks like it goes inward into the surface. And used for a lot of times that surface relief that you see, maybe bumps on a wall, scratches on a surface, some kind of pattern, kind of a rough, coarse, sandy looking pattern, really good for that also. Not good for things that actually need a profile change. That would be what we call a displacement, which we will get to in, it's not mandatory in our course, but we'll get to it either lecture 10 or lecture 11, kind of wrap stuff up. But now we're going to talk about creating a seamless texture in Photoshop. So let's establish the need for a repeatable texture first. So I've got Maya running, and what I'm going to do is open up my Project 6 demo file scene. And unfortunately, I didn't save the one from the other day we were working on when we did, the different materials with metal and plastics. But I'm just going to open up the default one, and we're going to assign the brick wall texture that we give you guys. So for today, you guys will, whoops, I just put that away. You're going to want to download the Lecture 8 new PowerPoint, the Lecture 8 Photoshop files. That's the source images. So here are the Photoshop files. And let me get rid of all the stuff that I did previously. We don't need any of this around. There we go. So you get a clone stamp practice file. We get a kind of an alligator skin, brick wall, red oak hardwood. All right, the brick wall is the one we're going to use. So I'm going to copy that. And I'm going to go to my Lecture 6 demo files, project folder, source images, and I'm going to copy that in there. I always like to make sure whenever I bring a texture in that it's in the source images of the project I'm set to. So I'm going to go set my project to the Lecture 6 demo files right here. Yep, that's it. I'm going to go back a level, click on it, hit set, file open. There's my sphere. Now, I've got, everything's got Lambert assigned to it because this is the default. So I'm going to select my helix and sphere. Let's give that a separate Arnold. Now, if you have your scene from when we did it together in Lecture 6, that's great. You don't have to do any of this, but I do. So helix, sphere. Let's turn off for now, let's turn off, we'll leave specular weight on. Why not? And we'll leave the default level of roughness, but let's knock that color down. Let's make it dark. Let's add a separate material to the ground. AI standard, just going to call this ground. We're going to turn off the weight on this one, the specular weight, because we're going to put a brick pattern on there, and that brick is pretty rough. It's more or less diffuse. But let's see what we get by default when we render. There we go. All right, so really super bright ground, no problem. Doesn't really matter. In fact, I honestly do not need to render this at all because I should be able to see everything in my scene in the viewport. All right, so I'm going to take off my resolution gate for now. So there's my ground plane. And you can see I got some brick there along with the concrete, but we're kind of got our own brick here. So I'm going to take that brick wall pattern that I copied into my source images folder and put it in the base color. So 2D file, click that folder. There's my brick wall. There we go. Now, in order to see a texture, I got to hit the 6 key. All right, so now that's really pretty gigantic. And what I want to have happen is I want it to be smaller so it looks like it would be appropriate for sitting on a patio. And these objects should be about the same size as my furniture. I went out to Home Depot or Lowe's and I picked up the good old helix and sphere, outside in the home and garden part of the store. And now I've got a brick pattern underneath of it, but it's way too large. I want to make it smaller. So remember, whenever you assign a texture or a file node, you are going to also get, so let's go here, let's do that. Ground. Oh, no, that's different ground. How is it I have two different grounds? That doesn't make any sense. There it is. All right. So here, I need this to repeat to make that brick smaller. Now, the problem is when I start making it repeat, and let's make it repeat one more time. It's smaller. It's kind of closer to what I want. But as it repeats, notice we are getting a noticeable pattern. For one thing, this texture has a watermark on it. So when I repeat it, that watermark repeats. Let me go back to having it just be a single time here. So here it is, basictextures.com. Now, since I want this to be smaller, I need to make it repeat more. So that's about what I wanted to repeat to. But when I do that, the top and the bottom are not meant to line up together. So when you repeat something in Maya or even in Photoshop, okay, what's happening is left will line up with the right, top will line up with the bottom. So it takes that chunk and basically copies it. You're basically copying it to make it smaller. And as it copies it, it makes the actual image smaller. So when I start to repeat this, 2 and 2, right, left lined up with right, top and bottom, we get this noticeable scene here where the top is not a complete set of bricks. The bottom's not a complete set of bricks. There's no grout between them. So we get this kind of really goofy looking double brick that doesn't line up. Left lines up with right. Well, they're not lining up properly. So we get these little bitty partial bricks in here. And we get a color difference. So this is where we would need to find a repeatable texture, or in our case, we are going to make it repeatable in Photoshop. All right, so let me save this. I'm going to quit out of Maya because Maya and Photoshop don't really play that well together for me. So I have to wait for that to, there we go. Okay, so what we're going to do at this point is let's take a look at project 7. And let me just make one adjustment here. All right. Just freeze the screen for a second. Hopefully that froze. Now we can go into 7. Let's resume sharing. All right, so basically project 7 is adding in maps, right? Diffuse maps, base color, spec maps, bump maps, displacement maps, roughness maps. You're going to choose to do one of your scenes, interior or exterior, day or night, your choice, whichever one you did, whichever one you would like. You're responsible for adding in textures to all the elements that require them. Remember, not every object needs a texture. Like the glass, for example, when we did the Zen garden, right? The wine glass doesn't really require a texture. It is a material property, clear glass. The wine doesn't require a texture. The wine bottle doesn't require a texture. So most objects have been given UVs. Modify them if they do not work for you. All right, so these are just kind of the different milestones that we have for you guys, what we're going to be doing. Read through it, please. Give you some examples of what final assignments can look like. And the downloads here, here are all your templates. There's your Photoshop files. There's your PowerPoint. All right. So first off, let me launch Photoshop. I'm sure many of you know a lot about Photoshop. And let's open up let's open up the clone stamp practice file that we're going to be dealing with. So I'm going to go File, Open. Let's go into the right folder. Photoshop Files, Clone Stamp. All right, so in Photoshop, you know, you guys have been using Photoshop for our templates, so you're familiar with the layers. The tools on the left side, if you see a little triangle in a lower right corner, that means there's a tool or there are multiple tools under that category. So the brush tool, we got a pencil, we got a color replacement, we got a mixer brush. Same thing with selection tool. You know, you've got a lasso, a polygon, a polygonal lasso, and a magnetic lasso. You got the magic wand. You've also got, come on, give it up. There we go. You got object selection, quick selection. The magic wand is the bomb. You know, you just have a bunch of different tools. When you select a tool, it will give you basically options across the top of the Photoshop interface underneath the menus that are kind of like attributes in Maya. So for example, I select the brush tool. I get a bunch of options for the brush tool, like opacity and flow and smoothing, and whether the mode is normal or are we going to be painting something weird. Size, hardness of the brush. You have different brush tips. Sometimes they'll show up in there. Now, also here in Photoshop, underneath the layers, you've got a bunch of buttons. We can create a new blank layer. We can create a group or a folder. We've got this little half dark, half light circle. Those are what we call adjustment layers. And we've got a mask. Now, masks are very powerful. You guys will use them or have used them in Substance. Photoshop's kind of the same thing. But for today, we're going to be using Photoshop to make something repeatable, which you kind of have to do if you plan on using that image in Substance and making it repeat there. So Photoshop is actually an image editing tool. It does it better than any other program. People over the years have drawn in Photoshop and used it to paint textures. Now we've got things like Substance Painter, which allow us to paint in 3D. And that really is a big leap. But Photoshop is still the primo image editing tool if you need to alter an image to either smooth it, sharpen it, blur it, process it with any of the artistic or photo filters it has. So, simple navigation in Photoshop, you guys probably know this, but if you open an image and right now this practice clone stamp is at 100%, if I want to zoom in, I can do Command plus and minus to zoom in predefined increments. I can go all the way to pixel level and I can zoom out so that my whole image looks like a pixel. Now, when you're zoomed in, if you want to navigate around, you can simply grab, those little side scroller vertical and horizontal sliders. Or you can hold the space bar down, that gives you the hand, and you can pan around just by clicking and dragging. Very useful. So, a couple of things that we're going to be doing in Photoshop. First off, let's open up that PowerPoint. Frank will recognize this. Some of this is based on the stuff that he did originally for us. All right, so we've got, this is basically a workflow doc. Got how to do the brick wall, how to do the floor, and how to do these little stools. They're called ottoman. They can either be used to sit on or put your feet on when you're in a chair. It's going to get a reptile hide. The floor's kind of got a wood pattern, and then the wall has that brick wall, and it's repeatable. Now, the idea is these are the default textures in there, and we want to make them repeatable so that we make them the right size, but we lose the watermark, we lose the seams between them, and we get something that looks more or less like this. Right? We got the brick wall scaled. It's, repeatable pattern has been minimized Same thing with the ottoman, that little reptile hide, and the floor. Now, if you scroll down, I've got the workflow for the brick wall. And the brick wall, we go through, we do the diffuse file, we do the bump map. And then mine, I've kind of got the slides kind of turned off so I don't accidentally go in. But yours has the activated one. So there's the workflow for the floor and then the workflow for the alligator skin. So if anybody's interested, we also have some videos in the, I think it's a playlist we have. It's called Lesson 6. The lesson number has nothing to do with what we're actually doing. It's just an old lesson number playlist that we kept. But the reason I bring that up is because the workflow for all three are here. We're only going to be doing the brick. All right, so a couple of tools we're going to be using today are going to be the clone stamp tool. That's going to allow us to basically, no, get out of there, blur. We're basically going to allow us to clone out or cover up certain areas with other pixels. And I always practice what's called non-destructive workflow, which means we try to leave our background or original layer intact without really altering those pixels. Everything we do is going to be layer-based, meaning when we clone stamp, we're going to make a separate layer, clone stamp on top of this layer to cover up. Now, clone stamp is really good for taking an area, a few pixels, and copying them and stamping them somewhere else. Very efficient way to do it. One tool you can clone, the other tool, you just release a modifier key and you can stamp. Now, some areas don't require pixels to cover something up. They require you to blend maybe colors or two different sets of patterns that are very close together. So what that means is we will use a tool similar to the clone stamp, but it's called the healing brush. And basically, it looks like a little Band-Aid. So this is the clone stamp. Looks like a bureaucrat's, rubber clone stamper. Come on, hold, there we go. So we're going to be using that. And Photoshop has these little movies that you can watch where they basically clone something and then move it over. So we'll be using clone stamp, healing brush. We'll be using the crop tool. We'll be using a couple of Photoshop filters and some Photoshop adjustment layers. Now, adjustment layers allow us to do certain things that you would do in a filter, but the problem is a filter alters the original pixels, whereas an adjustment layer creates a layer on top of the layer you want to adjust, and it doesn't alter the original pixels, just everything under that layer. All right, so let's go back, take a look at this. So primary objective, introduction to Photoshop. We're going to be doing the brick wall. When you're looking for images to use either for textures or even as reference, reference for textures, you want to avoid having certain things baked into them. It's called baked because they are part of the image. Flash photography will create a highlight. You definitely do not want artificial highlights in your textures. You want your lights and your materials to create that. That way they become realistic as you move in the world, they change. You don't want reflections baked into a texture. You don't want shadows baked into a texture. That implies light direction. Now, things like brushed metal, right? This gradient, while it looks cool, that we get that gradient based on our lighting and based on the roughness level of the surface. All we want is this little kind of streaky pattern to be used for our speck and our bump to give that brushed metal look. Now, when you go to create, well, we kind of went through this part already. When you go to create a texture, you have to find out whether you need to tile it in both directions. You know, for example, if we've got a wall texture, the whole thing works. We just need to make it repeat in one direction. Whereas you have a floor, you're probably going to need it to repeat in both. Now, if you don't know which one you need to do, assume it's got to repeat in both directions, which is what we're going to do to the brick wall. All right. So we're going to take a little time to go through this clone stamp tool practice image. And the idea is this was full sale for I think it's 127 before they ripped the floor out, where, you know, they were kind of getting ready to rip all the carpet out and just put the concrete floor down, you know, that coating we have on them. And, you know, we had a lot of dirt, dust, debris on top of the carpet. So we took a picture, and it makes for good practice to get rid of all this debris in this image. Now, to start with, when we do a clone stamp to get rid of, you know, dirt, debris, smudges, imperfections we don't want, the first thing we do is start with a blank layer. So we'll click the little plus sign down at the bottom right of layers, and that creates a brand new blank layer. Right? And I always like to label my layers, and Photoshop doesn't care if you have spaces, if you put in special characters. It's not like Maya. So I'm going to call that my clone layer. It's sitting on top. You can see it's transparent, got nothing in it. That's going to be where I clone everything, or basically I stamp everything. And the clever thing about the clone stamp tool is we're going to clone from the bottom, but stamp on the top. And that has an option for that. So you want to activate the clone stamp tool. Up in the attributes, you want to check your brush size. It's still called a brush, and make sure hardness is 100%. We don't want fuzzy edged pixels when we're trying to cover something up. Now, with that done, you want to check and make sure your mode is set to normal. We just want to cover stuff up. We don't want any special effects. Opacity is 100%. Flow is 100%. That is basically covering something up completely. We're not trying to feather line weight or get an artistic brushstroke look. We're just trying to cover something up. Now, the real thing about the clone stamp tool is this sample right here. The default is set for current layer. Current layer means it's going to sample and clone or stamp in the same layer. We don't want that. We don't want to alter this original background layer. So you change the sample to current and below. That means it will allow you to sample the layer below it and stamp to the current layer you are on. It's actually really brilliant. Now, in the clone stamp, just like the brush tool, you can change the size of your brush. So Photoshop gurus, how do you change the size of your brush? What are the shortcut keys? Anybody? Yep, brackets, left and right. Thank you, Clifton. So, got my brush down here. So as I go right, you can, well, let me activate that. There we go. So if I go right, you can see it getting bigger. If I go left, it gets smaller. And what I like to do is kind of make it so I don't cover up too much. I don't want to grab a huge giant section and stamp it in here. I just want to get it big enough to cover up my needs. And on a big blotch that I want to cover up, I'm going to sample it several times to get random pixels in there. But I'm going to start with, well, let's start over here, right on the upper left corner. So that one, going to make it a little bigger. That's probably pretty good. Now, if I want to clone, I hold the Option key down. Same thing on a PC. Hold Option down. Now, all the shortcuts, if they're Command on the Mac, they're going to be Control on a PC. But the Option key is the same. Whenever you hold Option down, your clone stamp brush goes into a target. That means you are cloning. And you are looking for pixels that are similar to the pixels you want to cover up. So I want some with dark value. I don't want pixels here to cover up there. It will look weird. And what I want to do is find some pixels around, like maybe here. So with the Option key held, I left click, let go of the mouse button, release the Option, and now I am in clone mode, and it gives me a little preview inside my brush window. So I can click, and now I've covered up that little imperfection there. So if I turn off my clone layer, my imperfection is still in the main image. So let's go over, try our hand on some of the others. So here, a little bit lighter. I want to try and again, we're going to copy or clone from a different location. So let's try over here, release the Option key, come down, left click, cover that up. Now, if I'm not happy with it, I can Z back, Command Z. Let me try it again. Let's try over here. See if I like that any better. Yeah, I like that a little better. So let's try it again here. Hold Option down, left click, release Option, stamp. Now here, you're always looking for similar pixels. So here, let's try that and see what this looks like. All right, so I covered up a few of my imperfections here. Now, for a big one like this, like I said, I'm going to copy from probably several different locations just to grab different pixels to make it look a little more random. So I don't like that last one. Let's try this. All right, you can even take these little areas where it kind of looks like the carpet got pulled up, little imperfections here. Let's try and clone stamp this. Just going to sample this area right on this seam there. And let's do that. There we go. So now we kind of got rid of that little pull on the carpet. All right, does that make sense? Anybody have any questions? Please feel free to ask if you have any questions. Nathaniel, Marie, Kentavious, Clifton's good. Thank you, Clifton. Jaser, Derek, Chanel, Brianna. Jaser's good. Marie's good. Thank you. Brianna's good. Some of this is probably old school for you guys, but still doesn't hurt. Kind of go through it. Now, when you've got a bigger area like this kind of brassy electrical access cover here, you know, I can clone it out. But what happens if I want to kind of clone it out, but at the same time, I want to leave like a brassy area where maybe some of that brass color leached onto the carpet? I can use what's called the healing brush. Now, the healing brush by default works just like the clone stamp with one big difference. It tries to average the sampled color and the target clone stamp area, average those two colors together to kind of blend them. Now, this tool has similar settings too. So there's the healing brush. No, show me the healing brush. There we go. Go ahead. So do that. Well, whatever. That was kind of uneventful. Didn't really show you what it was doing. Come on, get out of there. All right, so the healing brush has options for the tool very similar to the clone stamp. You want to make sure your hardness level is at 100%. Make sure the mode is normal. You want to make sure the sample is current and below also. You want to sample from below and stamp to the current layer. So you're going to have to change that. The default is current layer only. Now, with the healing brush, so if I want to get rid of, and it uses the same brackets, if I want to clone out the area, that's going to cover up the pixels completely, right? But when I use the healing brush, the area I sample from and the area I stamp to, those color pixels will be averaged together. So you can see I've got kind of the carpet pattern, but with a brassy look to it. So let me make this a little bigger. Let's try over here. So you can see it looks like it's going to cover it, but with the healing brush, it kind of gives it that little brassy look here. So again, this is really good for color differences for especially our brick, where one side lines up with, so left might line up with the right, but the bricks are a little different, slightly different color. This will average the colors together when you cover them and make it look really seamless and smooth. So, healing brush, really good for averaging color differences. Clone stamp, really good for just covering up blemishes and outright seams. So let's get started on our brick wall file. All right, so I'm going to load in the brick wall, which is right here. Now, before you work on it, I recommend you save your file as a PSD. Couple reasons. PSD will not compress the file. And if it uses any compression, Photoshop can undo it so it's back to its original state. So if you download textures off the internet, they're probably going to be JPEGs or PNGs, or maybe a TIFF. Very rarely will it ever be a Targa. But it'll be compressed. And if you open a JPEG, you are uncompressing it to work on it. When you work on it and save it, you are recompressing an already compressed file, which is crazy because after about 10 times, you degrade the image 50%. So get something off the internet you like, you want to keep it, open it up, save it as a PSD. So I'm going to save this as a PSD. This way, if I save it, I'm not recompressing a compressed file. I've stopped the file compression until I'm ready to output it for final use. So saved as a PSD now, every time I save work, I'm not compressing this file because this has already been compressed enough. Came off the internet, you know, who knows how many times it was compressed, and opened and altered and compressed, you know, before we got to it. All right, so let's go take a look at the actual workflow. So the first thing we're going to do, I'm going to kind of go through a quick overview of what we're going to do, and then we're going to do it. So we want to crop all the areas out that we don't want. We want to get rid of that top course or row of incomplete bricks, top row or bottom row. We want just nothing but complete bricks here. And we want to get about halfway up the grout because the top of the grout's going to line up with the bottom when this starts copying itself. Left is going to line up with the right. So we want to get rid of that watermark. We also want to keep it square. When you repeat it and you have a square image, meaning the pixels and the width are the same as the height, it makes it much cleaner and smoother for the computer, and also you will get a better result because you're basically taking a chunk and copying it over. You're not stretching it or distorting it in any way. So keep the image square. Square being width and height are the same in pixels. So we crop it. Then what we do is we offset the image. It's a filter in Photoshop that allows us to shift the left to the center, the top to the center, and it will basically act like repeat U and V in Maya. It will allow us to see where the seams are. Now, Photoshop uses what's called a filter, and it's an offset filter. So it shifts the pixels horizontally and vertically. We want it to wrap around because we want the texture, the left to line up with the right, top with the bottom. When we do that, we will see if we've cropped it correctly. We've got a seam here and maybe a little bitty seam in the middle, but we've kind of minimized the work. If you remember that image repeating itself, when we were in Maya, you know, we had a watermark. It was not square. It was pretty nasty. We had real visible seams going through the whole thing. Now, with this, once we see where the seams are, we're not going to offset it again. We want these seams to be in the middle because if we paint these seams out, this image will repeat itself perfectly. Why? Because originally, before we offset it, right, the center was fine. We just moved these seams left and right into the center, top and bottom into the center. So we could then clone stamp these out, use the healing brush to fix them so it looks more like this. So we clone stamp out. We can use as many clone stamp layers as we want, but in the end, we're going to have to combine them to use a filter on them. And we're going to be using a filter. Photoshop's got tons of stuff. Tons of sharpen filters, tons of blur filters. There's sharpen, sharpen more, sharpen edges, unsharp mask, smart sharpen, motion sharpen, I think. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on. But they only get applied to a single layer. Photoshop will not allow you to assign a filter to more than one layer, even if you group it together. So what we want to do is we want to apply a little bit of what's called a high pass filter. High pass filter will allow us to get more contrast between the pixels so the image looks a little sharper, kind of add a little bit back to all the compression that this poor image went through on the internet. So we've got this high pass filter. And again, since it is a filter, it can only get applied to a single layer. So what we do is we duplicate all of our work layers, and then we merge them together, and then we apply a high pass filter. High pass filter is going to kind of look like this until we use the correct blend mode, because this is going to allow the layers underneath of it to filter through and give us more contrast. Now, the beauty of using a PSD is we get to keep layers, we stop file compression, we get to save it out in any format we want. So for our diffuse map, we're going to have a whole bunch of layers that are going to be part of this final. These are our work layers down here. Here's our sharpen layer. And that gives us a really nice result. That's going to be our diffuse map. Once we're done with the diffuse map, then we're going to work on a bump map. Now, a bump map uses black and white information, doesn't care about color. So we don't really need color. First thing we can do is apply what's called a black and white adjustment layer. It doesn't permanently alter all the pixels. It just anything under that adjustment layer makes everything black and white. Now, when we make a black and white file, we have to decide if we were to take this into Maya, would this give us the right result? Right? We've got the grout, which is very light. We got the bricks, which are very dark. Well, in a bump map, black goes in or dark goes in and light comes up. So this gives us the reverse of what we want. So we have to use another adjustment layer called an invert. So now our grout is darker than the brick, which means it will go in a little bit. It'll look like it's recessed in our bump map. But the problem is we don't have much difference between the brick and the grout. We want to get a little more contrast between the two. So I like to use what's called a levels adjustment. Now, there's tons of contrast and brightness, exposure, levels, curves that can kind of get you the same result, but I like the histogram that we get in levels. Kind of a picture, a graph of what's going on. We've got dark, we've got midtones, we've got brights, and that tells me where all the information is. You can see a big spike here in the middle. That's all the bricks. That's basically gray, 50% gray. We want to get a little more difference between the bricks and the grout, because I want the bricks to come out a little bit more, the grout to go in. So that's kind of a quick overview of what we're going to be doing. Now, before we get started, any questions so far? I mean, I know this is a lot of information, which is why I'm recording it for you guys. But if I've lost anybody completely, let me know, please. Nathaniel, Marie, Kentavious, Jacer, Derek, Clifton, Chanel, Brianna. Just kind of walking through the overview of what we're going to do. All right, guys. Thank you. Still good, good, good. All right. So let's actually do it now. So first thing we want to do is crop this image. We want to make it square. So we enable the crop tool, which looks like two right angles. And you want to make sure in the tool options you go from, this is basically width and height. It'll basically give you the aspect ratio of your, that's really annoying. Stop the healing brush. Oh, right, up here. So we want to change it to be square, which means if I change this crop in any of the handle corners, it's going to keep it a square aspect ratio. So it doesn't matter what I do. Now, what we want to try to do is be as accurate as we can, so we can zoom in actually. And I want to drag the top down and get it roughly about halfway into the grout here. Now I can see these bricks aren't perfectly level. You know, this one's a little wonky, but that's all right. So I want to get about halfway in the grout between the top layer and the next layer. And I'm going to go down to the bottom and do the same thing. So down here, roughly about there. Now I still have a little bit of this watermark in here. But the problem is if I grab this corner or this edge and move it in, it's changing the size. I don't want that. What I want to do is actually, let's move the image just a little bit. So I can click inside the center of the image and kind of move the image underneath the crop tool. And what I want to try to do is first get that watermark out of there and then see if I can get halfway in the grout between a couple of these smaller bricks. Now, the left is going to line up with the right. So this little bitty piece here is going to fill in the gap here. This is going to fill in the gap here. That's going to fill in the gap over here. It looks like it might work okay. Might want to shift it just a touch. Looks like it's pretty good, like right in the middle. It's about as good as I can get it. So at this point, I think I'm ready to crop this. Now, to crop it or complete the operation, I can hit Enter, Return. I can come up here at the top of the tool options, click the checkbox. If I want to cancel it or undo what I've done, you can do that. But I'm going to click Crop. And before I save this, I want to make sure that this is actually going to work for me. Just because I cropped it doesn't mean when I offset it, it's not going to look like garbage. So now, let me just Z back one thing here. So I kind of lost my crop, but that's all right. Let's keep it square. Let's go in and do the same thing. Practice is good, even for me. Let's zoom in. All right, that's not bad. Down here, it's kind of the same thing. Pretty good. Let's move this over. Get that in the center. Get the watermark out of there. And you can see at the bottom, my original image, down here at the bottom of Photoshop, it says 1361 by 904. Now, when I click the Enter checkbox or hit Return, it changed my image size to be square now. Now it's 784 by 784. You know, you do yours, it might be 783, it might be 782, 785. Okay, it doesn't really matter if it's off a few pixels. It's approximate size I want it to be. Now, occasionally Photoshop will do like 783 by 784, probably because it's on the verge of being halfway between a pixel, which you really can't crop a half a pixel in Photoshop, so it kind of decides which way to go. As long as they are within 1 pixel of each other, it's square. And to offset it, we want to offset it so the left goes right in the middle, the top comes down and goes in the middle. And this will show us our seams. To do that, we need to figure out what's half of my new cropped size. So 784, can't do the math on top of my head. So bringing up my trusty basic calculator. So 784 divided by 2, that's what I want to offset it to, 392. Now, your numbers may be different, just whatever your numbers are down here, divide it in half, and that's what your offset will be. All right, so let's go and activate the offset tool. All right, to do that, just make sure you've got your background layer selected, go up to filter, go all the way down to other, and then go to offset at the bottom. Now, in Photoshop, whenever you have 3 dots or an ellipse, that gives you a user input dialog box. So I'm going to reset my horizontal and vertical to 0, which are probably what yours are going to be. And what I want to do is plug in my 392 for horizontal, and you can see it shifted left and right to be in the center. Let me go back again and do 0. All right, so 392 left and right are now meeting in the center, and that is a whole lot different than it was before. Vertically, I want to bring top and bottom together. So 392. So here is my new center. And you can see it more or less looks fairly seamless. I got a little bit of partial brick at the top and the bottom. I have some color variations here, but all in all, this will work. Now, some people say, well, couldn't you have cropped one more level of brick either at the top or the bottom, and then you wouldn't have this double wide brick in the middle? That doesn't bother me because I've seen brick walls actually like this. But, you know, if you want to be more accurate, yeah, you can crop another level out. But I like to keep as much of the image as possible so I can make my repeatable texture as big as possible. I don't really want to take away information. I want to try and keep as much as I can so that when I start to repeat it, it's big enough where I don't notice the same brick or two all the time in the whole pattern. I'm sure you guys have all played games where you can see, oh yeah, there's that brick, there's that brick, there's that brick. You know, they try and make it repeatable, you know, using just a few bricks rather than having a bigger image to save memory in the game. But we're not worried about that here. So this will work for me. If yours doesn't look like this, cancel, go back, crop it again, offset it, see how it goes. Every time you crop it, you may have different numbers at the bottom. But offset it half. I'm going to click OK. Going to get out of that crop tool so I don't accidentally do anything else. Now I'm going to save my PSD, add a blank layer, and let's clone stamp out some of these imperfections. All right, so clone stamp, created a new layer. Let's rename it clone layer. Why not? Let's get the clone stamp tool. Make sure your tool options are set up, sample, current, and below. Let's hold down the option key. I'm going to make sure I got the right size. First thing I want to do is decide, am I going to make the grout wide here? That would look funky. I'm just going to extend this little piece of brick. Got to make the bottom and then kind of clone stamp some center. So I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller. Hold option down, click to clone, And let's just move this like that. Looks a little wonky, but I don't mind that. It kind of matches up at the end. If I don't like it, Z back. Oh, no, I do like that. Let's redo. And now let's just kind of clone. Now, the one thing you have to watch out for is a lot of times, when you clone, you hold Option down and click, right? It's sampling from here, but I'm going up here, which is great. But if you reach a spot where all of a sudden you're not getting anything, or you're starting to get grout, that means the area that you sampled from, is moving with your brush. So, you may wind up with, ooh, I got a little piece of grout in there. I don't want that. So just kind of keep an eye on where you're cloning. Let's make this a little smaller so I can get a little more accurate down here. All right, so kind of happy with that. That looks like it'll work pretty good. I want to do the same thing at the bottom before I forget. All right, so let's clone here. There we go. Going to make it a little smaller. Yeah, that's a little noticeable. Let's sample again. All right, so my clone layer now, I've got the top and the bottom kind of fixed. What I want to do is let's go through, get some of these color variations, and this is perfect for the healing brush because I wanted to average these two colors together. So first thing I want to do, let's make that a little bit smaller. Let's click over here, hold Option down. And now when I click in here, it's going to try and average them together, which actually works pretty nice. So now we got rid of that little bit of a seam there. So that one's not bad. That's not too bad. I do see a little bit of difference. So let's just kind of minimize that and that. Got a little bit here in the grout. So now if I've got grout, I'm going back to my clone stamp. I want to cover this up. I'm going to find a nice big wide area. That brush is actually pretty big. So let's clone here, try and get rid of this right here. Right in the middle. All right, so again, that looks like a healing brush area here. A little bit of a healing brush going on here. Oops, how did that get so red? I don't like that. All right. So where's my center? Oh, I got a little bit here too. All right, so my center is right about here. Let's zoom in. Yeah, I see a little bit of a seam, but it's not really too bad right here. So back to the clone stamp for that. And it's right here. Let's sample up here. All right, going to save. So I did all of my fixes inside one layer. So I turn off my background layer. You can see where I've kind of cleaned everything up here. Mostly vertical seams. I did do a couple horizontals. So this is getting close to being done for my diffuse map. One thing I want to do, though, is let me zoom in a little bit, and it's going to be really hard to see in, Zoom with streaming, but the image is pretty soft, meaning it's a little bit blurry because of all the compression. What I want to do is perk it up a little bit, give it a little bit of sharpen, meaning more contrast between dark and light, so that it looks a little sharper. It pops a little bit more. Now, to do that, I need to use a filter called the high pass filter here in Photoshop. But a Photoshop filter will not work on more than one layer. So I'm going to shift select both layers, my clone and my background, right click, and then duplicate layers. Don't worry about the dialog box, just click OK. Photoshop will duplicate the layers, select them, and put the word copy. Thank you, Photoshop. Now, they're both selected, and I want to merge these layers together so they can become my high pass filter or sharpen layer. So with both copied layers selected, right click and merge layers. So I'm going to rename this, just double click on that layer, and let's call it high pass filter. So right now, this is a combination of those two lower layers. Now, high pass filter, make sure you've got the right layer selected. Go up to filter, go to other, go to high pass. Again, 3 ellipses. That's going to give me a dialog box. Now, by default, I forget what the default is. It might be 1, it might be more. Basically, what we're doing is we are allowing information to show through this layer, but since this layer is covering up the other two, nothing's actually getting through underneath of it. So we're just kind of filtering out the information below. So with a pixel radius really small, we get nothing but like 50% gray. That's all that we're seeing of that layer. If I increase it, go to 1,000 pixels. Well, the image is not 1,000 pixels. It's only 784. We're letting most of everything go through. Basically, what we want to do is we find somewhere between 1 and 2 to be a good radius for the amount of sharpness. I like to go 1.5. So now this is allowing a little bit of that high information to come through, but allowing a lot of the gray to stay in this layer. So I'm going to click OK, and you say, great, you just ruined everything I did. Yeah, but when you apply the right Photoshop blend mode, it will work correctly. So right now, we're seeing lots of gray, very little high, very little low. What we want to do is, let's go down. And the nice thing about Photoshop is, over the years, they've evolved this blend mode to actually let you preview it just by changing it. I don't even have to commit to it. I can just kind of go back and forth and go, well, that doesn't look good. That doesn't look good. That looks awful, 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 awful. Ooh, overlay looks good. Overlay will allow the original grayscale, 50% gray to show through, while allowing the highs and the lows to be boosted slightly with that high pass filter, mostly the highs. So overlay is what we want to use with our high pass filter. So let me kind of zoom in. You may or may not be able to see this over Zoom, but without the high pass filter, I'm going to focus in on these pixels right here. That looks a little softer or blurrier. And you say, well, Tony, you're zoomed in like 400%. Yeah, I know, but this is just for demonstration purposes. So that's a little blurry. When I turn on my high pass sharpened, I get a little more contrast. And like I said, I don't know if you guys can see that or not. But with high pass, without high pass, very subtle, but it adds just a little bit of sharpen to that image that otherwise might be just a touch blurry. So, like I said, Photoshop has tons of really good sharpen filters. You can use any one of them. Just high pass is very simple. I don't know why all of a sudden, go away, go away. Okay, so high pass filter, done, assigned. Now, one of the nice things about having it as a layer, if I think I've got too much sharpen, I can knock down the opacity, which means I control how much of that sharpen effect I want to have go through. Turns out I kind of like it all the way up, but you can always lower the amount. Kind of acts like an intensity control or an amount control. So these three layers now together are my diffuse layer. So let's go File, Save As. We want to save this to take it back into Maya. So to do that, I want to save it as a Targa. So format, we're going to change from Photoshop to Targa. And let's call it color. Well, let's call it base color. So we know where it goes. Targa file, 24-bit, default, beautiful, done. Now we want to make this into a bump map. So bump map, we don't need color information. All we need is black and white. So remember, white looks like it's raised up, black looks like it's receded or goes in. So instead of altering all the original pixels by selecting them, combining it, going up to image, making it black and white, we just go down to adjustment layers and we go right about in the middle to black and white. Photoshop will automatically convert the red, the green, and the blue to the proper shade of gray. You don't have to do anything other than sit back and enjoy your Photoshop. So the nice thing is I can turn that layer off and immediately have my color back. All right, so I got black and white. Now the problem is with black and white, I can now see, all right, my grout is lighter. If I use this, that's going to make my grout look like it's coming out of the bricks, kind of like an ice cream sandwich. It's melted and you bite into it and the sides ooze ice cream out. We don't want that. So I need to invert this. So down, adjustment layer, down toward the bottom, invert. Now our grout is darker than our brick. And some people, say, hey, well, that inverted all of the scratches and the bubbles or bumps. Now they're indented. Well, I've seen a lot of bricks where you've got scratches, you've got parts that come out, you've got little air pockets or basically little bubbles from the curing process of the bricks drying, creates an air bubble, which creates a little round indent in the brick. So I like all these imperfections, but I want to get a little more contrast. I want the grout to be a little darker, and I want my brick to be a little bit lighter. So, like I said, there's tons of adjustment layers. There's contrast or brightness and contrast, levels, curves, exposure. I like levels. Like I said, levels gives me a histogram or a picture of what's going on. So I've got three little triangles here underneath my graph, right? I've got a light colored one, a gray colored one, and a dark colored one. This represents my whites, my midtones, and my shadows. Right now, my whites, the lightest part of my image is probably right about here. So I got a whole lot of wasted information here. I want to make this right where it starts to slope upward. I want to make that the brightest part of my image now. Same thing with the black. Notice I've got a pretty big gap here before it starts to really get information. And actually, I think I might make it a little bit darker. I like my grout a little bit darker. I don't want to be completely black. I do want to get a little bit of variation in the color there because it is sandy. And now my midtone, if I drag my slider to the right, that's going to increase the dark areas. If I drag it to the left, it's going to increase the bright. So let's get this so the brick looks good. Let's get this so the grout still looks dark. It's going to be a combination of dragging the two around. So now my grout is a little darker. Let me turn that off so you can see. So this is pretty flat. You can see we had a lot of 50% gray in the bricks. But now with my sliders, I've adjusted the level. So now my brightest area is here, my darkest is here. I have my midtones all the way down here because I want my bricks to come out a little bit, but I still have some areas that are lighter and darker inside the brick. For me, that will give me a good bump map. For you, you might need to try a couple of different levels, save them out in Photoshop, see what they look like, see how much depth you're getting. Sometimes in the bump utility can increase the amount of bump. Other times, you can increase it, but it doesn't do what you want it to do. So you might have to come back and forth in Photoshop a couple of times, but try to get a good level of dark, a good level of white, and 50% gray is going to be flat looking. Just remember that in a bump map. White goes up, black goes in, 50%. You paint that in a bump map if you don't want any bump at all, if you want it to be completely level and flat. So this will work for my bump. So let's go save as, change it from Photoshop to Targa. Let's call this bump _ bump. Save. 24-bit. Going to save my PSD. Now, the beauty is, anytime I want to come back here and I need to work on my diffuse, I turn off all these layers. Now I'm working back on my diffuse. So I need to do something to the bump, turn those layers on, and I've got all my file information in one Photoshop file. All right, so to kind of wrap this up, let's bring this back into Maya before we wrap up here. And I'm going to quit out of PowerPoint also. Let's fire up Maya. I'm going to go back in to the scene we were working on, which is the Demo 6 lecture files. get back in there and replace that ground texture that we had with the original brick with our new files. Now, in order to do that, I got to make sure my files are in the source images, the ones I just made. So here's my base color and my bump. I'm going to copy those two and put them into my source images folder. There we go. Now they're all in there. I'm all set to go. Let's set project. Project 6 demo files. Let's open up. All right, so there's the default brick wall texture put on the ground. I'm going to select this and let's assign a new Arnold material. This is going to be called new brick. Now, before I bring this in, what I want to do is let's take a look at what the bump map looks like. Now, the reason I want to do this is because I'm not distracted by the color of my file. So let's see what that looks like. Let's go to perspective. There we go. All right, so what I'm going to do is let's drop this down, the weight to 0.18. Let's take off the specular. There we go. And let's go down to geometry, which is where we can plug our bump map that we just made in. So 2D texture, file. Go to file here. That's where we're going to plug in our bump right there. So I can see it a little bit in the viewport, but I don't trust the viewport. There it is. So let's get it to repeat a little bit better. It's kind of big. So how do I do that? Well, Photoshop. Let's get our new brick. I want to select the place 2D that contains my repeat U and repeat V. Ah, that looks pretty good. Try 3. That looks a little small, but not bad. All right, not too bad. You can see that we've made it repeat pretty well without too much of a noticeable repeating pattern. Now, the default depth doesn't look entirely bad. It's not bad. Where am I? Brick here. Let's go here. There we go. There's my bump. Let me lower the bump a little bit. All right. Good for now. Demo. All right. So the last thing I want to do is let's bring in my the diffuse map that we made and assign it. So to do that, let's select the brick. That goes into the color. So base color, 2D file. Let's load in our diffuse map, which is the base color. And you can see that the bump and the diffuse do not line up. Now, I could go in and adjust my place 2D, to be the same as my bump. The problem is if I come back in and adjust it again, I got to go to two different locations. So what I want to do is I want to have one place 2D control both my bump and diffuse file. And I can do that. This is the one that I worked so that it repeated properly. And all I want to do is have one of these also drive my diffuse. So there is a way to do that, but it requires middle mouse and a modifier key. So you'll notice that there's this little level of detail, looks like a Burger King icon here. This is basically just allowing us to be able to see, different levels of detail. And then we've also got a little icon of what the image looks like in the file node. So what we want to do is we want to hold Command down in the place 2D that is our master that we want to drive the diffuse with. Hold Command, middle mouse click on top of this little icon, click and drag, drop it on top of the picture or that little dark space where the icon should be here in your file node, release the mouse, and now it's made its connections. And if we take a look in here, now if I change how it repeats, it changes it for both maps automatically. So again, it was middle mouse, hold Command, middle mouse click here, drag to here, release the mouse, release the Command key. This is disconnected. You can get rid of it. So now we've got one place 2D to rule them all, and that will allow us control. All right, I know we went over a lot of stuff. It's kind of like a crash course because there's always, 50 pounds of information that we have 20 pounds worth of time to deliver it in. Questions from anybody? Now, this brick wall you can use in the exterior here if you want, if you have reference for it. You can use it in the interior. That wall with the windows is an accent wall. You could use the brick there if you want to. You could use it with the texture map. You could use it like it's painted, kind of like our ground is down here in the Zen garden, where we've got the brick back there. All right, so Nathaniel, Marie, Kentavious, Jaser, Derek, Darian, Clifton, Chanel, Brianna. Any questions before we wrap up here? Okay, Brianna, Chanel, Marie's good. Kentavious, think you got everything? Okay, fair enough. Like I said, lots of information. That's why I record this. We can go over it again if you need it. Clifton's good, thank you. All right, so let me save this and quit out of Maya. And I'm going to stop recording. And let's see, by the time we get out of here, let's have lab start up again at 1:45. So lunch break. go to lunch, come back to lab. Frank will be here ready, raring and ready for you guys. Frank's got a little bit of a presentation on reference again, because, what's the difference between project 6 and project 7? Well, now we're dealing with texturing, and some of your reference can be the same. Some of it you may want to change. All right, so we'll see you guys back here at 1:45. Have a good break. And don't forget, Friday, Anthony Bagsby will be doing Substance Painter, something you won't want to miss. All right, have a good day, guys. I will see you back here at 1:45.